Hello weavers, welcome to this video lesson on how to weave with rovings. Rovings will help you create a lovely cloud-like texture in your weaving projects. This video will show you 3 key techniques using rovings as the weft: tabby, sumac and loop weaving. First, a bit of background. Roving is a generic term used to describe any natural fibre that has been washed and carded in preparation for spinning into a yarn. It is one of the intermediate production stages of the yarn spinning process. There are several different types of roving depending on the proposed type of spinning. In recent times, wool roving has been used in the felting, knitting and weaving crafts to create a variety of interesting textures. Before we start on techniques, here are some tips on handling roving. We have a 2 metre long bump of merino wool roving here. Let's unwind it now. You will see that it is almost impossible to separate the length of roving if you try to pull it apart from end to end with your hands too close together. Give yourself about 20 centimetres between hands and the roving will separate easily. Also, most roving comes in a thickness that is too bulky to weave with. However, separating the roving along its length is easily achieved, as I'm showing you here. Our first technique is the basic tabby weave. I will be using a length of roving that has been separated in half lengthwise, as I've just demonstrated. Due to the thickness of the wool roving compared with spun yarn wefts, we will be weaving over 2 and under 2 warp threads. I always use a shed stick to weave with rovings, as separating the warp threads minimises wear on the roving. So I'm going to insert the shed stick over and under 2 warp threads at a time now. Then swivel the stick to open the shed and push it up a bit to allow room for the roving. I will now feed the roving through. I've wound the end of the roving in a small bundle to make it a little easier to feed through the warp. Make sure you pull the whole length of the roving through before you close the shed again. Tap it down a little with your fingers and tuck the tail into the back. Then close the shed and then tap again into place. Now take the shed stick out and reinsert through the warp with the opposite threads in front and behind the stick. Then open the shed again and come back the other way with your next row of tabby. When you pull through, try to twist the roving so that it curves neatly at the end of the row and sits flat. Next, pull the shed stick out again and reposition with the opposite warp threads in front and back. Continue this alternating pattern for the tabby weave. Now I will show you how to make the pile or loop weave with rovings. First, we open the shed stick again. Using a finer piece of roving, start as you would for tabby weave. Tuck the end in behind again. Then take a knitting needle, in this case I'm using an 8mm knitting needle, and wind the roving around the needle as shown here, going under and then up and swiveling back and under and up, catching the roving and pulling it out towards you. You may need to help the roving on as you progress along the row, as I'm showing you here. At the end, simply let the needle sit on the weaving. Then remove the shed stick and using a piece of scrap yarn, weave back the other way, going over and under the opposite threads for just one row. Then take the knitting needle out, then push the yarns down with the end of the knitting needle as shown here. For the next row, we'll reinsert the shed stick under the opposite warp threads and come back and repeat the steps we followed for the first row, but in the opposite direction. The final roving technique I will show you is sumac weave. I have a separate video that demonstrates this technique in more detail. The basic weave involves weaving backwards over 2 warp threads in the opposite direction to the weaving. Start by looping the roving around the first 2 warp threads on the right side of the weaving as shown here. Then, keeping the yarn hanging down in front of you, pick up the next 2 warp threads and weave the end under them from left to right, and then just loosely tap it down. Then continue in the same fashion, picking up the next 2 warp threads, always looping round in the opposite direction to the one that you're travelling in. When you reach the end of the row, loop twice around the last 2 warp threads, and then change the direction of the wind around so that you're going from right to left behind the next 2, and work back along the row. This technique will produce the lovely sumac weave stitch. Experimenting with different thicknesses of roving and different techniques can produce surprising results. Feel free to mix it up a bit with other traditional weaving styles and techniques. If you are after some wool rovings, visit my Etsy store for my roving packs and weaving yarn packs. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to be the first to know when my next weaving video comes out. Thank you for listening and happy weaving!